Local government are going to have a tough time over the next few years. What's your answers?
Well, I think the first point to make is that there's going to be this deficit reduction that takes place, but I think we need to be making the case to Scottish politicians and making the case to Westminster, to the Tory Liberal administration down there, that they're cutting too fast and too much. Because at the end of the day, Labour, before the last general election, had a deficit reduction plan. The Tory Liberal administration in Westminster have added another £40 billion to that, and really that's going to have a real detrimental impact on services. Not just services, the public sector actually provide a lot of work to the private sector, so I'm very fearful for the jobs that are going to go in the public sector and the jobs that are going to go in the private sector. So we need to make the case, I think, to central government, to Scottish Government, that these cuts are far too deep and far too fast, and really they need to think again. Alongside that, we're obviously going to have to look at all services and all budgets across the council to see how we balance the books.
From your perspective then, could we expect to see job losses in the public sector?
Yeah, very much so. Not just in the public sector, but if you take, for example, Fife Council, Fife Council trawled all its staff to see if they would be interested in taking voluntary redundancies, and they've had over 3,500 people come back to say that they would be very interested in taking redundancy. Now, all those won't be allowed to go because there will be teaching staff within that, there'll be home carers within that, so they won't be able to get that redundancy. But I do think that given that the council budget is about 60%, 59% of the council budget is made up of employee costs, you won't be able to reduce the council budgets without reducing the number of people that are employed there. Sitting alongside that, as I said earlier, you do have a lot of work that's put out to the private sector through local government, and therefore there's going to be a lot of private companies that are going to lose that work, and therefore a lot of people employed in the private sector that will lose their jobs. So this idea that you can have a reduction in public sector jobs and that somehow will be compensated for by a growth within private sector jobs is not going to happen, because the negative impact of a reduction in public expenditure will be very much to the fore within the private sector. So right across Fife we're going to see major job losses that we're going to have to counter.
A lot of people have talked about the council tax. Where do you sit with regards to council tax and how that could be used to fund the gap?
Well, the truth is that local authorities have no choice. They can't increase the council tax. In Fife, for example, it's estimated that if we were to decide to increase the council tax, then we'd be penalised by the SNP government at Holyrood to the tune of £27 million. So, we're not going to do that. There's no way that we would, the kind of rises that we would need in council tax to compensate for the penalties that we would face from the SNP Scottish Government, £27 million in our case in Fife. We just can't raise the council tax. That's the reality, but I do think that we're fast approaching a Scottish general election, and each of the parties, I think at that point, need to be absolutely clear that if they intend to continue to freeze council tax, then they must compensate somehow for it. Take this last week or two, we've seen major problems, people unable to get out their streets to get to work. My view is that you need to spend actually more money in investing in the capital infrastructure to be able to deal with these bad winters that are becoming much more commonplace. But local government doesn't have the money to do so. One option could be that you put someone on the council tax to try and help you do that, but it's not an option for us. You just can't do it. So council tax not going to go up this year. But my point would be that right across Europe, local government is able to use local taxation, and through that local taxation, local government are held to account. There is a fundamental question of local democracy here, as well as really starving councils being able to raise any money themselves. I do wonder sometimes if this SNP administration in Edinburgh want to make the Scottish Parliament the big council for Scotland, if they do want to do that, that's certainly the direction they're taking us in terms of the freeze on council tax.
Okay, Labour are in opposition in Fife. Would you oppose everything brought forward by the administration, and therefore would you bring forward an illegal budget?
No, not at all. We have the last 3 years produced what we believe was a fairly comprehensive budget that set out, to balance the books for that year, but also set out proposals to look at over the coming years that would have brought savings in. And unfortunately, in Fife, the SNP and Liberals just ignored that. And you do reach a point with SNP and Liberals in Fife when you think that there is no real point in trying to say anything to them. They think they know it all, and what we see is mistake after mistake after mistake. If you take this year's budget, for example, what's been said is that the officers are projecting that there is about a £29 million gap this year that needs to be clawed back in terms of the budget. Immediately looking at that figure, once you look at the detail of that figure, you see that the officers are proposing to raise £5 million this year to continue to restore balances. Fife's balances were wiped out almost a few years ago when they spent £30 million of balances to settle the equal pay claim that came nationally. So the council has been rebuilding its balances. But my point would be, this year when we have these cuts, where we have such threats to services, where we have real threats to jobs, this is not the time to continue to restore the balances. So not only will Labour be putting forward a proposal that does not include that £5 million, we'll actually be looking at using balances this year to try and help us get forward. There's also a figure of £5 million in those proposals that talks about the money that's needed for demographics and some of the pressures that are on there. Well, we need to talk to the Scottish Government about these issues. National government legislate to introduce policies around community care, to set out clearly how local authorities should be delivering social care, etc. If the pressures are growing and growing and growing, then that can't just be the responsibility of local government, because what we're having to do is look at cutting services elsewhere. The SNP and Liberals in Fife last year cut maths and English teachers in their secondary schools. At a time when we need to continue the investment in education, they're cutting that to deal with some of these pressures. So I would argue, again, as we come up to these elections this year, that national government has a responsibility for a whole load of these core services, and cannot expect local government to rob Peter to pay Paul to be able to try and provide services to meet the growing demands, but at the same time cutting maths and English teachers in our schools, as we saw with the SNP. So there needs to be a balance in how we move forward in trying to tackle this budget, and national government must accept responsibility.
Alec, what's next for Fife?
Well, in my own political group, in the Labour group in Fife, 24 councillors, we're certainly looking at all the proposals that have been brought forward for officers for cuts. Some of those are horrendous, but at this stage they've been brought forward in confidence. So we're looking at those and examining those. As I say, many of them we won't support. But the council have issued a consultation document on the budget where they're asking Fifers to give their views. The consultation that the council did last year, in my opinion, was expensive and flawed. This year I would urge people to get involved, because the council are starting to take us in a direction where we are not providing frontline services. They're dismantling, over the last 3 years, they've dismantled services that were built up over generations. So I hope that Fifers will give their views this time round. If you take the budgets in Fife, 40% of Fife Council's budget goes on education, 25% of the budget goes on social work, something like 10% of the budget goes on police and fire. So there's 70% of the overall budget almost that is going on these key services. That doesn't leave a lot for other services, so we need to look at those services as well. There's nothing that's protected, but I would say the frontline education is to be protected. I do think that the social services that we're providing at the present time needs to be protected, and we need to have further discussion with the Scottish Government and with national government and put the case for more money for local services. But I will certainly, over the coming days, weeks and months, be urging as many Fifers as possible to get involved in this consultation and let the SNP and Liberals know how much we value services and that these services are not up to be cut.